Good morning, everybody. Thank y'all for being on today. We're gonna start in just 1 or 2 minutes and let some of the folks get in from the waiting room. I feel like there should be an automatic rule for Zoom meetings for everybody, like stuff like this, where it says 11, but we all know it's going to take 3 minutes. So just Amber, have you started your new role yet? Stewart, Amber Stewart, if you're able to talk.
Hey, yes.
Good.
I'm in your neck of the woods now,
Well,
or our
welcome to the
neck of the
greater
woods now, I
welcome
should
to the
say.
greater Fountain Inn region.
Thanks.
Did you relocate for this
I
too?
did, yeah. Moved
Oh,
to
great. Well, welcome
Greenville.
officially. Yeah.
Thanks. I've been here a little week in a couple of days, so getting settled in.
Well, good. Glad to have you up here.
Thank you. Glad to be up here.
All right. Megan, if you're ready, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I think Destiny's going to keep an eye on the waiting room to make sure we don't miss anybody. But hello, everybody. My name is GP McLeer. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Community Engagement for Together SC. Megan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Meagan Diedolf. I am the Senior Vice President for Policy and Government Relations at the Conservation Voters of South Carolina.
Sorry, I'm doing too many things at once with Zoom. Thanks, Megan. Before we get go into the presentation, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'd love to hear from folks who are here today. We've got a packed slide deck today, packed a lot of content because a lot's been going on this year in the legislature. And we want to be sure we get to it. Also, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself in the chat, everybody, so we can also know who's there and start conversations if you'd like. If you have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. We will have time for Q&A towards the end, of course. We are recording this at least until we're done with the formal presentation. We'll stop recording once we hit Q&A. We really appreciate everybody being here today. I do want to promo that this is a program of the Advocacy Allies Peer Network for Together SC. We hope you all are members of that. We have a little under 300 members in our network. Megan is here with Conservation Voters. John, who's the President CEO of Conservation Voters of South Carolina, or Executive Director, one of those titles. He is a member of our leadership team, and Megan does really great work for their team in the public policy space. So we're excited to have you all here today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get started and everything. Make sure I can see y'all. Okay. And Megan, I'm gonna pin you as well so that people can definitely see us. Thank you all so much for being here today. Quick, oh goodness, off to a great start. There we go. Some reminders real quick. So we're going to jump right in. 2024 was a very busy year for the legislature. It is a very, very busy year for politics, of course, for obvious reasons, especially in the last 27 days or so. But we've got to kind of level set a little bit for the State House. There's been a lot of national news recently, but we're going to start with some State House reminders. The legislative session runs January through May. Second Tuesday in January through the second Thursday in May, technically. The legislature almost always goes into June through a sine die resolution, which is an agreement between the House and the Senate of what they can come back and debate if they want to come back after May. Typically always includes the budget and a couple other bills that maybe are either really big or need to be worked out in conference committee. So this year they ended on, I think it was June 29th or June 28th. So they ran the clock pretty long this year, which is not totally uncommon. And then also important to note, 2024 was the end of a 2-year cycle. So most of y'all on this call, I think, are aware of this, but for those who may not be as familiar with the State House, it operates in a 2-year cycle, meaning that if a bill is filed in January of 2023, that bill had the opportunity to be passed all the way until this past May in 2024. It has 2 years of life. After we hit that sine die date, that second Thursday in May, any bill that had not been approved, passed by both bodies, is gone. It has to start all over again in 2025. So everything that we're going to be talking about, some of these journeys may have started in 2023. Some of them may have started in 2024, but none of them will be as exactly they were in 2025. Some of them may need to be restarted, things like that. But there's this was the end of a 2-year cycle. So keep that in mind as we go through this, of why there was so much that happened in 2024, and because there was the end of a 2-year cycle. And yes, we will also get to it. There are elections, so which is a whole other dynamic for the legislature. So with that, I want to get to some overarching things real quick. By the numbers, there were over 2,500 bills filed this cycle over the 2-year cycle. A lot of bills. There were over 200 of those that were signed into law. Little under, around 10% is a pretty good metric there. Pretty common. There's a lot of bills that didn't move. I'll talk at least about one of those actually that was on our radar at Together SC that that did not go anywhere at all. So there's a lot of bills like that. It's kind of a reminder for those who are maybe dipping their toes into advocacy that a lot of bills out there. There's also, most of them don't go anywhere. There are 124 House members, just so that you guys are all aware, and there are 46 senators. This year in 2024, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later later today. This election year, all 170 were up for re-election in the State House, all state senators and all House members. None of the constitutional officers were up, governor, lieutenant governor, the treasurer, folks like that, but all of the legislature was up this year. I will note that this is only the first time in 12 years that only the legislature was up. And I'll talk more about that later, but there were no statewide offices on the ballot, including U.S. Senate or state constitutional officers. So it was a little bit of a unique election year in that regard. So that election pressure cooker adds to a lot of what we're going to be talking about. Meagan, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about some of the big things that occurred this year at the State House.
Yeah, we've had a lot going on this year, and top of mind for a lot of folks was the judicial reform. So the judicial reform has been an issue for a long time at the General Assembly. We're one of just, I think, 2 states that elects its judges by the General Assembly. And then all of the candidates that get presented to the General Assembly for election are vetted by something called the Judicial Merits Review Committee, the the Selection Committee, the JMSC. So after quite a big blow up in the press about some issues with the way that we elect judges in South Carolina, they finally, at the very last minute, passed a bill to sort of reform the JMSC process. To make it a little more fair, we have this issue with lawyer legislators picking the judges that they practice in front of. So that can be an inequitable result for a lot of people, or it is at least seen that way. So this bill ended up expanding the JMSC's membership from 10 to 12 members, and 4 of those are going to be appointed by the governor. And the governor up to now has not had any input in the judicial selection process. They have put term limits on the JMSC members so that you can't be a lifetime appointee and then have more and more, decision-making abilities over these judges that you might be practicing in front of. And then it raises the cap of the amount of finalists that the JMSC can present to the General Assembly for votes. So generally, they only were allowed to present 3 finalists, which could be knocking out a lot of really qualified candidates from being selected. So they've raised that up to 3. Now, this is seen as a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's taking care of all of the problems that people have noted about the JMSC. But I think this was a good step. So we'll see where it goes from here. Another bill that was a big piece of this legislative session was this anti-CRT bill, that's critical race theory, and it was officially called the Transparency and Integrity in Education Act. And this was one that would have prohibited specific discussions of race or gender or sexual orientation and how they factor into the inequities that exist today. This was obviously a big Freedom Caucus push, but there were a lot of far-right Republicans that were sort of behind this as well. The bill started in the House and actually passed the Senate too. But what ended up happening was it got to the conference committee. The conference committee worked out a deal, and on the very last days of session, they went to both the House and the Senate floor because they needed something called free conference powers, and the Senate was not able to get those. So the bill failed in minutes before session was over. So I would expect that you'll probably see that again in the next couple of years. I think we're going to do some more deep dives on the energy reform bill and the budget. So GP, do you want to take the next two?
Happy to. Thanks, Megan.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll also add that for judicial reform, the governor did come out. He signed the bill into law, but he did not. He included a statement with that that he believes that the legislature could go further in judicial reform, so there might be more to come on that. We'll see what happens. The two that I want to talk about, and then I've got a little bit of a theme for this slide, is school choice. Right out of the gate in this cycle, there was an expansion of school choice in South Carolina, or more specifically, school vouchers, education savings accounts that can be applied to private education for families. This Senate took the lead on that, and it ended up passing both bodies. That one took up a lot of oxygen early in the session this year. It changed a lot of what was done last cycle. There was a school choice program that was pushed out last legislative session. I'm sorry. And this expanded the criteria of eligibility for families to participate in that program. A lot more South Carolinians are eligible to use that program, and it also expanded the amount of money available for that program. There's a lot of conversation on both sides, from private schools and charter schools, private schools and the public school sector on this one. We could see additional school choice come forward in the next cycle. They're not quite done yet. But the Senate this year did not want to take up too much more school choice. So I should have prefaced by saying all this was mostly in the House. The House wanted to expand that school choice program. Sorry, unanimous consent to restate my remarks. But the House wanted to expand that school choice. The Senate did not have the appetite to do so. We fully expect this to keep continuing. There's a big push for this expansion. There's also a lot of talk at the federal level about school choice, so there will be a lot more oxygen on this. And then, without getting into all of the different bills, there were a lot of what I would call renewed culture wars pieces of legislation or amendments offered up throughout this cycle. South Carolina does have a slightly growing Freedom Caucus, and one that is making having a lot of legislative action behind it. And a lot of these items are coming out of that caucus, but also just in general from the parties, the difference of the parties, and the fact that we do have pretty much a one-party control state capitol. We're seeing a lot more of these, as we're seeing across the nation. A lot of these are coming in the forms of amendments offered on the floor or budget provisos during the budget debate, which don't allow for a lot of robust conversation at the public level. We'll get into one of our themes from this for this year but that rules matter, and subcommittees are the only time you get to have public comment on these bills. And when you offer an amendment on the floor, there isn't that opportunity for the public to provide that commentary. So we're seeing a lot of this play out on the floor. You can obviously expect that the election obviously has a lot to do with this. Some lesser known ones that we wanted to highlight for y'all. We highlight those big ones for obvious reasons. They are big pieces of legislation, but they also take up a lot of oxygen in the room. A lot of the calendar was taken up by those issues over the course of these months. But there were a couple lesser known things that popped up specifically for nonprofits to be aware of. First up is nonprofits and developers. A little bit of a lesser known issue, but there is in South Carolina, there is the ability for developers who are working on affordable housing to partner with nonprofits. And once they do that, it allows, and I'm oversimplifying this, but it allows developers to get that property tax break as if the nonprofit owns that piece of property, as a way to incentivize investments in affordable housing. It's a positive concept in general. However, what ended up happening is some developers in some cities began to really sort of exploit that by creating their own C3s and using that as a tool to get that property tax, to no longer pay taxes on that property. And it's something that cities flagged as well as nonprofits flagged. And there was a bill that ended up passing. That passed both the House and the Senate, had different versions and could not come to an agreement in the last minutes in conference committee that would have made that tax liability shrink based on the proportion of ownership that the nonprofit has. We expect that to come forward again. I know the Municipal Association has been really big on this one because there was a city that saw essentially overnight $600,000 in property taxes evaporate because of a major development leveraging this. And if you do that in a lot of smaller communities that maybe don't have a $600,000 property tax bill on a development, but over time that will really impact local governments, as well as that's not really the intention from the nonprofit sector that we're seeking. We're not trying to use C3s as a way to skirt the intention of the law. So that was one that was a little lesser known that died in the last few minutes of the session. One that got through in the very last minutes of the session, and shout out, I don't know if she's on the call today or not, but Erin Predmore at Greenville Connects led this effort. The transportation penny. There are two types of road taxes that counties can enact in this state. One is a capital project sales tax that can go to roads. It can also go to major capital projects. Those have to be itemized. They have to be very specific. If you need a case, a lot of counties have these across the state. If you want to see a live one happening, Greenville County is currently debating a capital project sales tax for road. The other type is commonly called a transportation penny. It's a little bit more flexible in what it can fund. It can fund greenways, public transit, roads. It does not have to be as well defined on the ballot. Both of these require a public referendum, a vote of the county to be implemented. But there's one primary difference. A capital project sales tax allows for groceries, requires groceries to be exempt. The transportation penny, which is a little bit more flexible, does not allow for that flexibility. Groceries are taxed in that one. Greenville Connects, one of their big win this year was having that legislation amended in the last minutes of the session and signed into law by the governor. The transportation penny, now counties can opt to have groceries exempt from that, which, as you can imagine, makes that a little bit more palpable to the electorate in most cases. And then there's anti-DEI bill. This one is, as I mentioned earlier, is one that we flagged it together SC that went nowhere. But I wanted to highlight that for y'all. We'll make this recording available, and once I'm done, I'll turn it over to Megan. I'll put a link to this bill in the chat. There was a bill pre-filed in December from some House members that made it that would not allow public agencies, so state agencies and any public subdivision thereof, so school districts, in particular higher education, cities and counties, could not promote diversity, equity, or inclusion. That definition of promotion is pretty broad. It included DEI statements, DEI positions, DEI trainings. It also started to do the roles of contractors for those agencies. This is something that we've been sort of watching at the federal level. There was actually a bill filed this year that also has not gone anywhere. That would prohibit nonprofits who receive federal funding from doing similar work, specifically nonprofits. We saw this bill, while it mostly was about public agencies across the state, as starting to get really close to, if you get grants from a state agency, if you have contract work with a state agency, that it may impede your ability or your right to talk about DEI, to support it, to do what you need to do, and your commitment to DEI. So that one did not go anywhere, but as a flag for everyone to think about moving forward, as we see that as a potential big impact on nonprofits. Megan, you want to take the last three?
Yes, I'm glad to. Let's talk about regulations. I hail from the House Regulations Committee. That's where my legislative background is from. So I get a little passionate about regulations. But at the General Assembly, they're treated a little bit differently than bills are. So every regulation that an agency wants to pass has to go to the General Assembly for review. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but generally that's the way it goes. Now, the General Assembly can choose to vote on the regulation, or they can sort of put it in a drawer and let the regulation automatically time out. And if there's enough time in the session, the regulation can automatically be promulgated. But if the regulation is introduced late in the session, then there has to be a vote, because the regulation wouldn't automatically promulgate. And that's kind of what happened with this Department of Education book regulation. Basically, what the regulation did was it created a state policy that schools were required to ban books that describe any sort of sexual conduct or excretory functioning. So this has pretty wide range of books that it might affect. I know some have noted, like The Color Purple or the Canterbury Tales or Everybody Poops. These are staples in your local library, I'm sure. Those would be affected by this bill, or excuse me, by this regulation. So the thing was, this regulation was introduced late in session. So generally, without a vote, the regulation would not have passed, except for a weird maneuver that they did in the sine die resolution. Generally, the sine die resolution notes that regulations that haven't been automatically promulgated by the last day of session time out and die. This time they took it out so that this regulation could be allowed to pass. And that was kind of a sneaky move, because it's one of those one lines at the very bottom of the sine die resolution that nobody reads. And it had this huge effect that now this regulation is in full force and effect. So keep an eye on your regulations, y'all, if you're doing advocacy, because sometimes these sorts of sneaky things can happen, and they are treated a little bit differently and require a different level of advocacy at the General Assembly. But going forward from there, we've got the campaign funds for childcare bill, which passed. We've joined one of 31 other states that already allowed this. So basically, an elected official can use their campaign funds, or a candidate can, to get childcare. This is going to help encourage more parents and caregivers and mothers to be able to run for office. And so it's a good thing. And then the period tax was eliminated, and this bill started up in the House. It was introduced by Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter. The second sign-on for this bill was Representative Jordan Pace, who's become kind of a very out front Freedom Caucus member. So an interesting cohort of folks that push for this. But as of July 1st of this year, there is no longer a tax on your menstrual products. So excited. Yes, campaign funds bill passed.
Thanks, Megan. Next up is the budget. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. You can see we're going to go through some highlights on this. The budget is way too big to give you a deep dive on. But the $13 billion budget passed the state this year at the end of June, signed into law July 1st or 2nd. Don't worry, there was a continuing resolution, so nothing shut down. Here are some highlights. It included cutting the income tax rate to 6.2% when it was originally budgeted to be 6.4% this year. This is a march to 6% that the governor laid out as a priority a couple of years ago, and they've been doing a small cut every year since he announced that. Y'all may remember there is something called the HEX fund, which is the home tax exemption. It's a long story. There's a fund of about $600 million that was available that grew at a faster rate than anticipated. And so they diverted a lot of those funds into things like 99.5 million of that went to expedite the income tax rate reduction. A lot of it also went to roads, bridges, and rural infrastructure authority. An additional $200 million, for instance, to county transportation committees for local road projects, more money for DOT for bridge repair, and then also additional money for sewer and water infrastructure across the state. The budget also raised the teacher minimum salary to $47,000. The governor has a goal of $50,000 as a starting minimum salary for teachers, something that has been pretty actively increasing over these last few years. I believe the starting rate a decade ago was around 36,000. So we're seeing pretty great investments into education on that front. Also, state employees saw a raise at various levels. Of note that I want to spend a little bit of time on for nonprofits is vetoes. There were 21 vetoes issued. Not all of them were money related, but of the ones that were $2.1 million, and they were almost all earmarks. That were $2.1 million in earmarks. That said, there were still $425 million in earmarks that were awarded to local governments and nonprofits. Nonprofits made up about 90 million of that, based on some reporting, and the link I'll throw in the chat when I turn it over to Megan to an article about that. I'm highlighting this because it's an area that Together SC has found itself in conversations with since the American Rescue Plan Act was being discussed at the State House, and how we can, if y'all remember, Together SC was leading the charge on trying to carve out funding for nonprofits in that. The state opted for more infrastructure related things and only funded a very small number of very large buckets. But in that process, earmarks also came up. There's a call from the governor for even a more competitive process, a competitive grants process for these types of projects. I would also note that, and I'll link to it, it's linked in the presentation, but his veto message, towards the end of his veto message where he talks about earmarks, I would note that it's kind of a good read for nonprofits to understand his approach as a governor to the earmark process and the work that's been done in the legislature to make them a little bit more transparent. Together SC does not have a stance on earmarks. Many of our members receive earmarks, but if they're going to talk about how they give money to nonprofits in the state, we want to be sure that you all are well represented in that conversation. That we want to help the state meet those transparency goals and accountability goals, and we want nonprofits to understand the process. So we are continuing to participate in those conversations when we can. So I would just acknowledge that as to quote Megan's boss John, flag that for folks. Because it may become an emerging conversation over the next few cycles. With that, I'm going to turn over to Megan for a little bit of a spotlight on conservation voters of South Carolina. They do a lot of work in this state. They're one of the few nonprofits in this state that also have a couple other entities associated with them. They have a C4 and a PAC, so they have very, very active at the State House. And they had a really big issue that they were tackling this year. And we wanted to be sure that since Megan was able to co-host with us, we wanted to give you a really great highlight. Megan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Before I jump into that, I was wrong about the campaign funds being used for dependent care. That did not pass. My apologies. And thank you to the commenter who pointed that out. But so CVSC is a Conservation Voters of South Carolina. We have both a C3, a C4, and a PAC, as GP said. So we're sort of able to use all of those tools in the toolbox to try and get good environmental policy passed. And this year, a lot of our time was spent on energy. We have some really big decisions to make in the state in regards to how we generate our energy going forward. We've noted a lot that South Carolina is the fastest growing state in the nation. We have more industry moving here. We have more people moving here. And every one of us on this call, I think, expects that when we flip the switch on the wall, we expect our lights to turn on. But we're also at the cusp of some really big changes related to climate change that we need to make so that we can continue to protect our natural resources and mitigate some of the effects of what's going on, across the world. So we would love at CVSC to see our energy, we talk about a three-legged stool. We'd like our energy to be clean, we'd like our energy to be affordable, and we'd like it to be reliable. So the General Assembly sort of took all these big questions, and their answer to those questions were about what was 5118, H5118, which they called the Energy Transformation Act. And it was really a bill that was much more focused on, taking South Carolina and committing us to another 50 years of generating our energy from burning fossil fuels. They wanted to build a huge fossil fuel mega project along the banks of the Edisto River. The bill stripped a lot of protections for customers. I think energy is going to be a big kitchen table issue going forward because we have the fourth highest bills in the nation for energy. And we have communities across the state that are, a household is spending up to 35% of their total income just on their electricity bill every month, which is untenable, right? And so to strip those customer protections and put all our eggs into a very expensive natural gas basket was going to make that situation a lot worse. It also stripped a lot of the protections for the environment. So for example, with this bill, if it had gotten passed, it would have allowed a utility to start constructing a new facility without ever having obtained any permits or certificates. So they could have gone ahead and filled in a wetland and through it, started the building process and destroyed that natural resource without ever having been checked by anybody. So there was a lot more to be said about that bill. It was about 70 something pages, as I recall. But basically, CVSC could not support it. So we engaged in this huge campaign where we spearheaded the campaign against this bill. And as a result of our efforts, we saw a ton of media attention, which I was really excited about. The media really came out and said, this is a problem. We are suspicious about this bill. We've seen what utilities have done when they're unchecked in the past. And I'm, of course, referencing the VC Summer debacle. And we need to see some accountability here. We had thousands of emails and phone calls to the General Assembly, to lawmakers, asking them not to pass this bill. We had a beautiful rally where at one subcommittee, over 100 people signed up to testify. And these were regular folks that came to talk about a very technical piece of legislation. And unfortunately, a lot of those voices weren't heard. But it really showed legislators that the people of South Carolina were watching. Now, of course, this is the second year of a 2-year session, and there are going to be shenanigans with any sort of bill. What happened was the bill passed through the House after several weeks of subcommittee hearings and a full committee hearing and a little bit of debate on the floor. The bill passed, but it went over to the Senate. And the Senate looked like it was going to be speeding through this piece of legislation. The subcommittee was chaired by Senator Luke Rankin, and they really didn't take a lot of testimony. They didn't spend a lot of time. And it really wasn't until they got to the full committee where Senator Wes Clymer said, hold on, I have not read this bill. I do not trust the utilities. They are the ones that cost the state billions of dollars several years ago. And I need to be able to properly vet this piece of legislation. And from that point forward, the Senate really came out and said, absolutely not. This bill is too dangerous to pass without adequate discussion and understanding of what's actually in it. And as a lobbyist, it was one of the most beautiful moments in my life when Senator Massey got up and just talked for 30 minutes about how bad this bill was. I couldn't have been more happy, you know. So unfortunately, that was not the end of the story. As I said, at the end of a 2-year session, shenanigans were afoot, and the energy bill ended up becoming a kind of a pawn in a lot of other conversations that were going on. So a lot of times at the end of a session, the House and the Senate will fight over a couple of different bills. The House has its priorities, the Senate has its, and they'll sort of trade jabs and see what they can do to force the other one into some sort of action. So on the House side, they used this bill and tacked it on to a bunch of unrelated pieces of legislation to try to force the Senate to use it. They tacked it onto a suicide prevention bill. They tacked it onto a firefighter's health insurance bill. And that was met with a lot of disgust from folks, right? Don't use those sorts of really valuable pieces of legislation to pass an energy bill. It's not related. And in the House also tried to sort of push them to pass this legislation by holding up a Senate priority, which was a healthcare restructuring bill. It was going to restructure a bunch of health agencies to make them a little bit more efficient, and they held that bill up. So what the Senate did is they ended up taking the bill up on the floor, and instead of passing the 70-something page bill, they trimmed it down to just a 1-page statement of legislative findings regarding energy. And they very clearly said it is this piece of legislation or it's nothing. So the shenanigans continued. The healthcare bill failed minutes before the General Assembly gavelled out for sine die. And the bill ended up going to conference, the energy bill. And thus far, we've seen no meetings announced. It looks like it is dead for the year, which I couldn't be happier about. But the conversation's not over, because we do still need to make some of those big energy decisions going forward. We do still need to make the right decision for South Carolinians. We cannot continue to pay high prices because of monopoly utility choices. So we've got to really be paying attention. We'll be working this issue throughout the off season. We've already started to have conversations about what's next, but it will be back, I expect. So the end is a question mark there.
Thanks, Megan. I will say this bill was another, as we mentioned earlier, was a big one for the year. So, and one of Together Seats members was right in the thick of it. And so, it's a lot of technical pieces. Energy will be a very big conversation. I remember them getting hung up on water usage for AI data centers for like a whole day one day. So there's a lot. This will be an ongoing conversation at the federal level. It has also been one. There has been a federal bill passed to kind of encourage additional nuclear investments in the country. So this is not just a South Carolina issue as well. So just I believe you'll hear more from conservation voters as we go forward. We did not want to leave today with, of course, mentioning elections. In case you didn't know, there's an election in November. It's a couple of them. We mentioned earlier that all 170 state legislators were up this year. We're just going to focus on the state, by the way. So there were filing opened in March. There were 367 candidates who filed for state legislative offices. Of those, of all of the 170 districts, roughly 57% of House seats are already decided after our June 11th primaries and June 25th runoffs, and 39% of our Senate seats are already decided after June 25th. South Carolina does not have many competitive districts at the state level. I'll let Megan touch on that in a minute because her organization monitors that a lot closely, very closely. So that's sort of the status. In November 5th is election day. There will be every all of us will have somebody on our ballot, whether or not they have an opponent is hit or miss. We do have a breakdown on Together SC's website, and I'll put a link to the blog in the chat after this slide is over. That gives you a more firm breakdown, including a link to a spreadsheet that has all of this data on there for you to explore on their own. I'm going to highlight the Senate incumbents and then hand off to Meagan. I think that's what we talked about doing. Incumbents, we had 40 senator incumbents file. That's 87% of incumbents in the Senate ran again. 3 of them lost their primary battles. All 3 were Republican women senators in the Senate. So the incumbents in general fared pretty well. Female incumbents did not fare as well. Senator Marjorie Bright Matthews is running unopposed, and Senator Tamika Isaac Devine in Columbia does have a challenger in November. And then there are other female candidates, of course, on the ballot in November across the state as well in various seats. But in terms of incumbency in general, incumbents fared pretty well at the Senate level. Meagan, do you want to talk a little about the House and some competitive seats?
Yes. So again, just like in the Senate, incumbents seem to fare very well in the House. There was a concerted effort to defeat a lot of the Freedom Caucus people, and every single one of those efforts failed. So 105 of the House members filed. That's 85%. 3 of those lost their primaries. I think it's very interesting that the 3 that lost their primaries are all members of the House LCI committee. LCI is Labor, Commerce, and Industry, which is the committee where the energy bill was passed through. So, and that includes their chairman and vice chairman. So it was pretty interesting election night that night. In terms of competitive seats, there just aren't that many. Out of all of the districts that we've talked about from people far smarter than I that have done the math, there are only about 15 to 16 competitive seats in this state. So really elections, of course, are decided in the primaries because we're so gerrymandered. But we'll see what happens there. The election comes up in November. So make sure you go out and vote.
Yep. And like I said, the spreadsheet that's linked in Together SC's blog that has a breakdown of how many the party breakdown of the elections remaining of the elections that will be competitive elections that will be in November. So these numbers, just so you know, there are some incumbents that maybe have an alternative party challenger in November. We don't count them as winning until they win. While their chances are high of winning, there are other incumbents likely to be in, and those who are kind of uncontested, but not really uncontested. So there will be some new faces though in the state house, and for those of us who work in the advocacy world, which I hope is all of us at some level in the nonprofit field, we have a start of a 2-year cycle, and there's going to be some new faces to get to know and talk to. I will also highlight that we have our issues forum, nonprofit issues forum, and does have a date set for November 20th. We'll be releasing more information on that. Last year, this event sold out, where we have nonprofits come talk about some of the major issues that we anticipate being on the forefront in the legislative cycle. We will also have a post-election deep dive as a part of that issues forum, being as this is after the November 5th general election. So mark your calendars. There'll be more information on that. It'll be in person in Columbia, and we'll have more later on. It'll be in the afternoon in case you need to mark your calendars. Cycle. And after this, we're going to open up the floor for questions, comments, and the like. Some of these, if you were on our call last year, these are very similar because they hold true. And to be honest, these are a little bit evergreen, and we are going to kind of unpack them a little bit. Relationships matter. That's kind of self-explanatory. However, I wanted to highlight why they matter in a different way than maybe you think. The legislative process only provides for public comment on bills at the subcommittee level, unless you are extremely special or specialized, and the committee offers that opportunity. The only chance that the public has to engage, to provide direct public comment during a meeting, is at the subcommittee level. Once you get to the floor, especially, there is no more public comment provided. We talked about how there are a lot of amendments being offered up on the floor. In those moments, the legislators are the only ones who have that ability to speak on the issue. So having a strong relationship with folks who can champion your cause is important, because sometimes when the moments matter most, if they're attaching it, as Meagan said, to random bills, Meagan wasn't able to go inside and talk. It was legislator to legislator, and so relationships matter in that regard. Related to that, rules matter. They always matter, but rules are increasingly more prevalent in strategy. How can we? What Megan's alluding to, there's a kind of an obscure rule in the House rules that allow you to attach, if something's going to conference committee, you can attach another piece of legislation to the conference committee, to what you're sending to conference committee. And that's how the energy bill was allowed to be attached. Typically that would be considered not germane, not relevant, but because of that one rule, that's how they were able to get it in. Sometimes that can be used for good. Sometimes it can be used for not so good, depending on your position on issues, but those rules really matter. And so understanding the legislative process and working as that always being something of a learning process for nonprofits is important to keep in mind. Meagan, you want to cover the last two?
Yeah, so I mean, coalitions are extremely important in this work, and I'll talk again about the energy bill. I said that CVSC spearheaded this campaign, but we would not have been successful without building the coalition that we did. And we turned towards the traditional environmental partners like the Sierra Club, the Coastal Conservation League, Upstate Forever. But we also went outside of the conservation space and worked very closely with AARP, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, and had great success because we had such a diverse array of people and ideas that helped to all come together to push back on this piece of legislation. And so that really worked for us well. But on the other side of that, you can see that coalitions can work against you too. And I'm talking specifically about the Freedom Caucus. This is a group of people that is small but mighty. I've been sort of watching their activities for the last couple of years, and they really pushed, just that one small group of legislators pushed the General Assembly far to the right, which you saw when we talked about some of these bills individually. So watch those coalitions closely. And then, you know, the election pressure cooker is always an exciting part of the second year of a 2-year session. Every 2 years, the House is up for election. But when you have the entire General Assembly up, the entire General Assembly suddenly becomes very careful about how they vote on certain pieces of legislation, and whether that they'll attach their name to a bill if it could be used against them in the upcoming primary. So they're all watching who's filing in those months. You know, I think it's up to April where people can file to run in a primary. They're all watching to see if they get opposition. This is, as GP said, 12 years since we haven't had any constitutional officers, which was kind of an interesting piece. And then this was that year where all of the General Assembly was up. So as a lobbyist, I had to be extra careful in how I talked about things and getting people to understand our position, especially when it was a little bit more controversial. So it was good times.
Thanks, Meagan.
Yeah.
With that, Destin, if you want to, we'll stop the recording. And for those watching, thank you. Watching later,